All right, welcome everyone. This is the first video in the lecture series for our Business 342 course, and hopefully this lecture series will be valuable to you. I think it'd be better to do it this way in some cases than the alternative. And if you're watching this, I'm filming these in the summer of 2020, but I'm filming them so that I can use them again later. So we'll see what evolves as far as the modality of class. But if you're watching this, it means that our course is either online or partially online. And so these lecture videos will be a supplement to the rest of the materials that you'll find in Sakai. So for each of the lectures, we will have a series of learning objectives. These align with the learning objectives that you can find in the text. So hopefully, by the time you watch this, you've already read the text. It'd be most valuable to you if you read first and then watch the lecture. But of course, you can watch them whenever you want. They'll be available to you. But the purpose of these videos is to supplement the text material. So I'm assuming you've read the text, and then what I'm providing you, I'm not going to read back the text to you, but provide additional information and content on top of it. And you can expect in the tests for this course, we'll cover material both that you find in the text and material that you find in the video. So here are our learning objectives for this video. The first one is, can you answer the questions, what is human resource management, and why is knowing human resource management concepts and techniques important to any supervisor or manager? Then we'll move on to look at examples of trends in human resource management, and then we'll look at consequences of these trends in the human resource management function. And then we'll move into looking at what kind of competencies do you need to have as an HR manager. And I think what you'll find shortly here as we get into our first learning objective is pretty much everybody is an HR manager. If that's your title, it certainly applies to you. But if you own a business, or manage a business, you will find yourself performing many of the functions of an HR manager, even if that's not your title. And then last, we'll spend a few minutes looking at the outline of the book, which also serves as the outline of this course. Okay, so with that, let's move on to our first learning objective. Okay, so learning objective number one, this is the start of the course. So our first objective is to talk about what exactly do we mean by the term human resource management? What does that function do in the organization? And why is it important to know something about this topic as you proceed on your business career? So before we get into what human resource management is, let's first talk about what we mean by the term management. So human resource management is one element of business management, but it is just one. There are other functions. So when we think about what is an organization, it seems obvious, but there's a definition for it in the book. But an organization is any group of people working together for a common goal. So that an organization can be a company, for-profit company, which is primarily our concern in this class, but it could also be a nonprofit. It could be a volunteer organization. It could be an educational institution. It could be any sort of group of people, a government agency, who are working together to achieve a common goal. And within an organization, there are managers. Managers' jobs are to oversee the work of other people, supervise other people. Okay, so that's what we mean by management. So what are the five basic functions of management? Those are planning, organizing, staffing, leading, and controlling. Those are the five categories. And what this class is focused on is the staffing part of it. And so when you think about if you're a management concentration student, for example, you are going to be or should be studying each of these elements in other courses. And this course covers the staffing part of it. Okay, so what do we mean by staffing? Well, let's look at the definition of human resource management next to answer that question. Okay, so what do we mean by human resource management? So the book provides a definition, which I have here on this slide. It is the process of acquiring, training, appraising, compensating, and attending to the labor relations, health, safety, and fairness of all employees. So let's think about that for a little bit. First of all, we talk about acquiring employees. So that's recruiting, right? That function is an HR function, looking for, finding the next employees to come into the organization. So once they come in, once you've hired them and you've gone through the hiring process, the next step generally is to provide some form of training. Depending on the kind of employee, on the kind of company, this can vary quite a bit, but in most cases, most companies provide some form of training. Employees also need, as they do their work, they need to be evaluated, and that's what the appraisal system is designed to do. And then, of course, the thing we all care about the most as employees is how are we going to be compensated. And so the HR function is heavily involved in the determination of compensation. But then there's a compliance function. The other items on this list, the second half of this definition, deal with a lot of compliance work. So making sure that overseeing labor relations, so the relationship between management and labor, and that is very different in a unionized workforce than in a non-unionized workforce, something we'll talk about towards the end of the class. But the human resource function is also quite a quite important part of it, to focus on the health and safety of employees, making sure that all of health and safety regulations are being complied with. And then when we talk about fairness concerns, this is where we are focused on things like anti-discrimination laws that apply. So the HR function in part is a compliance function, and it also has this other list of things that it does that are dealing with acquiring and training and appraising and compensating. Now, what you'll notice later, hopefully you'll notice this later when we get to the end of this video, we're going to look at the structure of the book and by extension the structure of the class, and you'll notice that the structure both of the book and of the class follows this pattern. So starting with acquiring, training and development, compensation, and appraising, and then compliance and regulation. We'll actually be talking about compliance and regulation throughout, but the structure of the topics follow that pattern. Okay, so now let's dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by human resource management. So what are the concepts and techniques needed to perform this task? And this you can also find in the book, but I thought it would be worth spending a few minutes talking about it because this has kind of a linear flow to it, kind of like I mentioned on the last slide, as far as the flow of the functions of human resources. So the first one is conducting job analysis. We're going to spend some time talking about job analysis. And what it essentially means is reviewing what kind of jobs are needed in the organization so that then you can make a plan for who to hire and when to hire them, and then select the candidates that fit that plan. Now I can tell you, again, I mentioned at the top of the video that I'm recording this in the summer of 2020 in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and pretty much any plan that was made last year for hiring in almost any organization has been affected by the pandemic, which while some in the government may have seen it coming, I would say most organizations probably did not have this in their plan. So plans are just that, they're plans, and they're affected by what happens in the real world, including things like pandemics and other bad things that happen, like wars or terrorist acts or natural disasters and that sort of thing. So again, coming back to our list, so we conduct the job analysis, we make a plan, then we go and we look for employees that fit into that plan. Then once they come on board, we do new employee orientation. Any of you who have a job working pretty much anywhere is probably familiar with this. You've been through some sort of HR orientation, and that's usually within the HR function. So then, once we have these employees on board, once they've been given their orientation, then we move into our management function where we are looking at how much employees are being paid, ensuring that they are being compensated fairly, ensuring that there's no disparities or inappropriate differences. HR is also very involved in providing the benefits that you receive. And by benefits, we mean things like health insurance, dental insurance, vacation, paid family leave, all of those types of benefits, whether they're required by the government or whether the company chooses to offer them, are generally managed in the human resource function. And then something that has been changing a lot, and we'll talk about this in this class, is appraisal, performance appraisals. They've historically been done in a kind of traditional way. I've been through many of these over the years. Your manager fills out a form, provides you with some analysis of your how well you're doing your job, and you get some sort of score. And if you aren't meeting your requirements, then you go on some improvement plan. That's sort of the traditional path of appraising employees. But there's increasing body of evidence that suggests that that's not a very good way to do that, to appraise people. And we're going to actually see some examples of this in the class, some current event examples of companies taking very, very different approaches. The human resource management function is also very much a communications tool for the company. Is very much involved in communicating with employees about their employment. Not only things like changes in benefits or other information that employees need to know, but also providing a certain amount of counseling and advising, and when things go badly, providing some amount of discipline. That is inside the HR function as well. We've already mentioned training. That's something that happens throughout the life cycle of employment. It's also something, I will mention, that gets cut when budgets get tight. So when you are in a period of time like now where you have this really unexpected downturn and sharp downturn in the economy, companies are looking for ways to save money. They often will look to their training and development budget because it's not directly connected to the bottom line, and it's generally fairly expensive. And so you'll see in times like this those kinds of initiatives under attack from the budget. And then the last one that's listed on this is building employee relations and engagement. We're going to talk a lot about this term engagement. You'll see it throughout the book. Pretty much every chapter has some version, some learning objective connection to engagement. We'll talk about what exactly we mean by that term. But when we're talking in general about employee relations, the HR function is heavily involved in making sure that the best possible relationship that the company can have or that the organization can have with its employees is actually being realized. So that is part of the job. So if you think about this slide, this is effectively the job description of an HR department inside of an organization. And the size of the organization really doesn't matter, other than maybe sole proprietorships where the owner is also the only employee. But as soon as you have that first employee, you as an owner or as a manager have all of these, some degree of all of these functions. They grow, of course, as the size of the workforce grows, but every one of these functions is still important in a small company, just as important in a small company as it is in a very large company. So don't forget that, and that is something that as a lawyer over the years, I've seen many small companies make mistakes and get into some trouble by not realizing that. Okay, so on this next slide, what we're talking about is what kind of things does a human resource manager need to know? What information do you need to have in order to perform all of these functions we just talked about in a competent manner? And the first one here, and this is even more important in, again, the times that I'm recording this, summer of 2020, we have a big problem. We have always had a big problem in this country about equal opportunity. We have seen over time affirmative action programs come and go, but we still have a dramatic underrepresentation in senior management by every kind of group that you might imagine. So number of minority CEOs, there's age discrimination at all levels, there's discrimination against, in all other kinds of things, against people with disabilities. So there's all kinds of discriminatory outcomes that are very, very common in the workplace. There are laws against it. We will be talking about all of those laws, or many of them, in this class. But the problem is that you can't necessarily legislate this kind of behavior in people. So it's up to, in part, the human resource management function to ensure that the organization is acting appropriately, not only legally, because there's a legal requirement, but then there's also a moral and ethical requirement, which is generally higher than the legal requirement. It also varies by state. Some states like California have far more aggressive legislation on this topic than others. So in any case, it's something that every manager, every business owner needs to know. What are the rules to keep you out of trouble? And then what are the aspirations as far as making gains for the future in equal opportunity? And we'll talk more about what equal opportunity and affirmative action means in this class, both as a legal concept and as a moral and ethical concept. Next, the HR manager needs to know what the rules are with respect to health and safety. And again, this varies dramatically from one state to another. I have had clients who have expanded, started in Washington, expanded to a place like California, and have lost their business over their inability to understand and manage the risk and the liability associated with having employees in another state. So there are federal rules, there are state rules, there are local rules. And if you have employees, you have a legal, ethical, and moral responsibility to know what those rules are so that your workplace can be as safe and healthy as possible, certainly, and as required. And then the last thing that a HR manager needs to know is they need to know enough about their job that they can handle grievances and labor relations. What happens when an employee complains about something? How do you handle that situation? Well, you can't just go off the cuff on that. You have to know what the rules are. So the point really of this whole class is to arm you with the information that you need in these three categories. These are broad categories, but basically everything we're learning is providing you with a basis of information to perform this function in your organization. Okay, so if I haven't convinced you already that this information is important to you as a business owner or manager, take a look at these statistics. About a third of businesses have appointed non-HR managers to become their HR managers. So what does that mean? It's very likely, there's 1 in 3 chance that as a manager in a business, you'll end up doing an HR function. And this has happened to me, this has happened to my wife, this has happened to a lot of people that I know. People who weren't necessarily technically trained in these functions, but were put into this role. So be prepared for that eventuality. Even if you don't see yourself as an HR professional pursuing that route, you will end up doing this as part of your management job. And another stat is that 50%, it says here, over half of the people working in the U.S. work for small firms. This is something that is kind of a hidden reality. We think about companies, you hear the chatter about it, the rhetoric about it, we think about big evil corporations. But big evil corporations actually don't employ that many people relatively to the overall population, to the overall working population. Companies like Boeing have hundreds of thousands of employees. That's obviously a lot of people, but it's actually less than half of the employees in the whole country, of all the working adults. So what does that mean? It means you have a very high chance that you'll work for a small company. And if you work for a small company, as I mentioned a few slides ago, you have every responsibility that a big company has with respect to your employees. You have to still manage them and perform all of the HR functions that a big company has to do, but you probably don't have somebody whose sole job is to do that until you grow big enough for that, which means that the founders, the owners, the initial managers are going to bear the burden of that responsibility. So the point of this slide, even if you are not planning to become an HR specialist, that's not your career path, but you are planning to go into a management career, you are very likely going to need to know a lot about HR. And that is why you are in this class. Okay, so here we're going to talk about something a little bit technical, but this is important for understanding the responsibilities of the HR function. So there are two kinds of authority when you think about this term authority, and in these days that's a little bit of a loaded word. We probably should use a different term in the future, but for now this is kind of how we think about it. So what authority are you engaging in when you are acting in any given role? Now those of you who have been in my 303 class, the business law class, or taken any business law class, you should remember the term agency. And if you don't remember the term agency, what it means is that you have, in an agency relationship, you have a principal and an agent. And the agent acts in the place of the principal and on behalf of the principal. And employment is, in and of itself, the most common example of agency. So when you're an employee, and I use this example in my law class, if you're a cashier, for example, at a store, and you are collecting money, the money that the customer hands over to you when they buy something doesn't belong to you. You are collecting that money for the principal, as if you were the principal. So the principal has authorized you, has given you authority to accept money on the principal's behalf. So that's just a simple example, but whenever you're an employee, you are acting for the organization that you work for. So in my case, I'm a professor at the university. The university has the authority, the responsibility to educate you, but obviously the Board of Regents isn't going to teach all the classes, so they have to hire faculty to teach the classes. And so we have the authority to deliver the material. The people in the business office have the authority to charge the tuition. The people in food services have the authority to deliver and collect money for food, so on and so forth. So whenever you're acting as an employee, you're acting in some way, some version of exercise of somebody else's authority. It's being delegated to you. So when we think about this from an HR perspective, we have these two ways of thinking about authority. One is what we call line authority, and line authority is what a manager would have. A manager is a line manager is someone whose job it is to give orders to the subordinates, to the agents, right? The agents beneath them. So this would be the classic manager-subordinate relationship, and the subordinate works for the manager. All right, so that's what we call line authority. It's the right or the authority to give orders to subordinates. Now, human resources is what we call staff authority. And staff authority is where you have an employee whose authority is not necessarily to tell other workers what to do, but to provide services to other managers in the company. So in-house lawyers, which is what I was for a long time, is the same thing. It wasn't my job to tell the workers throughout the company what to do or what not to do. It was my job to provide legal services to management, who then issued orders, hopefully in accordance with my advice, but not always. So, and that's actually, that comment is actually applicable to HR. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. HR managers are very often in a very similar role to lawyers. In fact, there's a joke that HR people are lawyers without the title. And one of the problems that you often have in a staff authority role is that line managers don't listen to you. You can tell them to comply with one or another directives, but at the end of the day, if they don't do it, then that you don't get to tell them what to do. You advise them and hopefully convince them to act in the way that you want. Ultimately, there's discipline if they don't comply with the policies of the company, but as an HR manager or as a lawyer inside a company, your authority is limited to providing advice to other managers. In fact, my wife just had this problem in her company. She has an HR role. She's not the HR manager, but she has an HR role. She writes a lot of the health and safety policies in her company, and she wrote policies about the reopening of businesses after the COVID-19 pandemic, and it turns out that some of the location managers just simply weren't following the rules. So the company had a policy, it adopted the policy, it communicated the policy, and then there were line managers who simply weren't complying. And that's a reality of being a manager, and that's not unique to HR, but HR managers deal with it all the time. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that a line manager would do. And you can find all of these on page 5 of the book. But a line manager is responsible for putting the right person in the right job, starting new employees in the organization, training for new jobs, improving job performance for each employee. These all sound very HR, right? Very HR specific. So managers who manage people have a large role in the deployment of the HR policies of the company. You can read the rest of these, but a line manager controls budgets, controls scheduling, controls the distribution of responsibilities, controls the setting of goals, all of those kinds of things that you as an employee, those of you who have jobs are used to receiving from your manager, those are all the things that a line manager would do. So let's look now at what are the functions inside of the HR department. These by now, at this point, should be fairly, you should know them because we've talked about them already on several slides. We've talked about them in a functional sense, but now we're in a responsibility sense. But here we're going to say, what are the common, in a large HR department, what are the subunits of a large HR department? And you can actually see on page 6 of the text, there's an org chart, a sample org chart of what an HR department would look like. But the common functions that you see inside of an HR department are you'll have a recruiting group whose job it is solely to go bring in the new people that they need to bring in. You have some who are responsible purely for equal opportunity, making sure that all of the equal opportunity rules and policies are being applied. We're going to be talking a lot about this later, and it's a huge risk to companies, but it's also a very important moral and ethical obligation on the part of companies to make sure that they are providing equal opportunity. You have a specific function in job analysis. In large companies, there are whole departments of people who just do job analysis. We'll be talking about this later in the class, but job analysis is really doing things like analyzing what kinds of work needs to be done and making sure that they have people doing those functions, completing those functions. You have compensation, which is in and of itself its own discipline. There are many HR professionals who do nothing but deal with compensation. There are whole consulting firms who do nothing but consult with companies and organizations about compensation. They do compensation surveys and analysis and studies to make sure that the company is paying the right price for its employees. Training and development is its own function as well. Similarly, there's a whole market of consultants that do training and development. So it is in and of itself its own subdiscipline in human resources. And then labor relations specialists, this is particularly important in unionized workforces, where labor relations has a very different flavor to it than in a non-unionized workforce. And then of course, there are many companies that have both, some union workers and some non-union workers. And so the function of labor relations is different because in a union context, it's governed by a very specific contract. All right, so that brings us to our second learning objective. So in the first learning objective, we talked about what do we mean by this function, this HR function. And now we're going to look at some trends and some statistics. And of course, we are living in a very difficult time, and many of these trends and statistics that we see that are in the book, or even those that were published, early in 2020, are very different now as we move into the second half of 2020. But the first is, I always like to look at demographics. The table 1.1 on page 7 of your book is a chart that shows some long-term demographic stats. This is, I think, very interesting because, I graduated from college in high school in 1987, from college in 1991. So this data starts about the time I entered the workforce. And if you look at some of these numbers across the rows, you'll see some things jump out. So, for example, the workforce is getting older. If you look at the number of 55 plus employees, it's gone from 11.8 to 24.8. It's expected to go to 24.8 in 2022, according to this data. We're going to talk a little bit about the age of this data in a moment. But even setting that aside for a moment, that's a very big shift. The workforce has fewer younger workers and more older workers. And that's just a matter of demographics. As the baby boomers age, they continue to be a larger percentage of the population. Eventually, as baby boomers leave the workforce, you'll see that number start to change because there isn't the next demographic group isn't as big as them. You can see that the workforce is becoming less white. For sure, 85 to 77%. And where is that being picked up? Well, you can see here that the African American population, as a percentage of workers anyway, stays relatively flat. The Asian population is growing, but the Hispanic population is growing much more dramatically. So the workforce is becoming older, it's becoming more diverse, and the percentage of the Hispanic percentage is growing at the fastest rate of all the minority classes listed here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this chart is somewhat aged. If you look in the footnote, it was this comes from 2013, which is 7 years old now. So what are the current trends? Well, and for that, what I'd like to do is we're going to cut over to my desktop, and I'm going to show you how you can look up the current statistics. One of the great things about our program, our employment program in the United States, is that we collect a lot of data about employment, and you can access all of that data on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. So let's go over there and take a look at that. Hello everyone, and this is something I wanted to show you here about the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And you can see on this website the very detailed data that is available. So the data that's in the book ends in 2013, or was produced in 2013 and looks forward to 2022. But here on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, you can actually look at this information down to very detailed levels. So if you'll see here, I have the page pulled up. This is household data, annual averages. This is a number of persons employed by occupation, sex, race, and Hispanic or Latino identity. These are numbers in thousands. Now what you can see in 2019, you can see there were 157 million employees of 16 years or older. 47% of them were women, 77.7% were white, which is very similar to what we saw in the projections that were in the book. The African American percentage is 12.3, Asian 6.5, and Hispanic Latino 17.6, which is that number is growing like we talked about. But now what you can do is you can actually drill down by category to all of these different categories. So let's look here, for example, look at chief executives. How many chief executives are there? There were 1,602,000 of them, but only 27% of them were women, 88% were white, and only 4.1% were African American, and only 6.2% were Hispanic or Latino. So this is where you can kind of see the disparities. So by job classification. So even though the white percentage of the overall working population is only 77%, they make up 88% of the CEOs. And African Americans have 12.3% of the overall population, but only 4.1% of the CEOs. That's one example. And you can go down here and you see over here on the left, I'll scroll down slowly, you can see these are all the management occupations, financial occupations, professional and related occupations. So you can drill this down to any kind of job. Let's see, just out of curiosity, lawyers, 36.4% are women, 86.6% are white. So you can see there's a disparity there in my profession as well. So the reason I wanted to show you this was we're going to be coming back to this throughout the class because of all of this data that's available. It'll allow you to do some research. And you can see up here at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website all of this resource that's available. Before I show you that though, you can download the data from this table here, and I'll bring it in. I've got it, I already downloaded it over here. And so you can see it here, it downloads it into a spreadsheet. And that allows you to you can sort, you can do all kinds of analysis with it. It's just all publicly available data. And then you can see all the different kinds of data that's available. Here's just like, we'll just do these top picks. So you can select all the different information you want, and then you can retrieve the data. So for example, let's look at the unemployment rate, seasonally adjusted unemployment rate. Retrieve the data, and there it is, and goes back, in this case, 10 years. So this is very, very easy information to obtain, and as we talked about so far in the video, obtaining, analyzing, understanding the market that you're in is incredibly important, and this data, this source, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is where you're going to get a lot of the data to do that. Okay, so let's look at a few other trends in the workplace. One of them, this trend has been going on for a long time. You can see it in this chart here on the left, is that our economy is a service economy. Well, it's always been a majority service economy, as you can see, but manufacturing was a much, much larger percentage of our economy than it is today. It was over 40% there in the 1940s. during and certainly immediately after the war. And it's been on effectively a down decline ever since. And it's now, less than, that's about 15% of our economy is manufacturing. So we're mostly a services economy. That's an important thing to know because it's most likely that the employees that you're going to be dealing with, most of them, are going to be service employees. The other thing that you see here in this chart on the right of the slide is that independent work is growing and growing and growing. And we all know this from the trend of gig workers. More and more people work for themselves as independent contractors, making money directly as opposed to being an employee. We will talk in this class about what it means to be an employee versus an independent contractor. This is an area of law that has evolved. It continues to evolve, and it's becoming more and more difficult to treat employees as contractors than it used to be. And we see that in states like California, who are changing their laws to make it almost impossible for employers to hire contractors. And there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about when we get to that material. Okay, so the other thing that's really important, and this is true not just for HR, this is true for anybody who is in business management, you really have to understand the economy that you are working in. It's very important that you stay in tune with trends and statistics and information about what's happening in the economy. If there are projections for a downturn in the economy, that has huge implications on planning in the HR space. You don't want to be planning to hire a bunch of people if all of the experts are telling you that the economy is going to take a downturn next year and if your business is linked to it. Remember that some businesses do well in downturns. Some businesses, they're anti-cyclical. So you have to understand your business and you have to understand the economy in which the business is operating, and that will be the underlying data that you use to do workforce planning. When we talk about workforce planning later, this is something that you'll see. You have to kind of take a guess as to where things are going and make your plans based on that guess. And you can't do that without having some knowledge about how the economy works. So this chart is interesting and you can look at it in your own time, but it shows you, breaks down our economy in terms of imports, what kind of things do we import and what kind of things do we export. And you can kind of see by category how our economy is made up. It's very important to have a good sense of how the economy is structured when you're trying to operate in the human resources function. Okay, the next two slides are come directly from the book, but also are now showing some age because of the trends that we're seeing here in 2020. But both of them make an interesting point. The first one is the GNP, Gross National Product, over, I think the chart starts in early, like in 2000 and goes through 2018. And you'll see that gross national product grows over time. It almost always grows, which makes sense. We add population and there's inflation in prices, so you see GNP will increase. But you'll notice that there was a big blip there in between 2008 and 2010. That was what was referred to as the Great Recession. Those of you who've had me in 303 know that I was kind of part of that. I was in the subprime mortgage business, which was generally blamed for triggering that whole downturn. But the point of it is that there are these times, even though the economy generally grows, it does go through these phases where it takes a step back. Something that we're experiencing right now in 2020 that relates to the COVID pandemic. So you can see that GNP took a fairly substantial dip, but it of course recovered and went on a long expansion, which is just now in the process of ending. And then that's figure 1.2. Figure 1.3 shows you what happened to housing prices. Housing prices, you might think, well, why do we care about housing prices if we are thinking about things from a human resource management perspective? Well, this has a lot to do with what kind of employees are available and where they are available. If housing prices get too out of hand, people are priced out of markets. This is something that has been happening in Seattle over the last few years. It's getting harder and harder for the companies that need to hire there to bring people there because it's just so expensive to live there. Now, the other thing that happens when there's a huge downturn in home prices is it affects people's wealth. So most households in the United States get a large chunk of their wealth from the appreciation of the value of their home. And if that goes down, then that affects people's wealth. It means that they are it affects their spending, their willingness to spend. It affects their ability to move to a different place. It affects all kinds of things that might impact your ability to hire them. So it's very important, again, making this point, that it's very important to understand the macroeconomic trends going on in the economy in order to undertake a reasonable human resource planning program. Okay, and the last one, which is kind of a troubling chart, this has been a problem for a long time as well, and that is that what we call real wages, or which is the amount that your salary, the amount of things that you can buy with what you earn, has not been growing very much. And you can see it here. We're still below the peak from the 1970s. As far as real wages goes, you can see the line through the middle is the increase in salary. So you might make more today than you made 5 years ago, but it's in all likelihood not making a lot more in real terms. You can't buy a lot more with that increase in your wages. The prices of things increase faster than wages increase. And so even though we've had this long expansion, which we saw in the last chart, you do see real wages increasing, but they're not increasing at the same pace as nominal wages. So workers, even though they continue to receive increases every year, aren't really wealthier as a result of that. And that's been a systemic problem in our economy for a long time. The last one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart. It's just an example. This is, again, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which we've already looked at, but just kind of shows you the kind of information that is available. So you can, and one of the key metrics that any HR person needs to pay attention to is what's happening in what we call the non-farm payroll. This is a measurement that the government produces of how many people are working in non-farm jobs, non-agricultural jobs. And this is our sort of data for our key unemployment information. So in times when there are fewer jobs available and more workers than jobs, then you have this imbalance in the supply and demand for work. That's very important to know if you are hiring. Similarly, if things are the other way around, if there's more openings than job seekers, which has been the case for the last few years, then that means companies need to pay more, provide more benefits to entice workers to come to work for them. That's been the problem for the last few years, but the COVID situation in 2020 is really changing everything. It's going to be interesting to see after this period of time whether the employment market recovers to the point that it was prior to the pandemic. Okay, so this brings us to our third learning objective, which is some of the consequences of these trends that we just talked about on the human resource management function. And we talked a little bit about this already, but let's just look at a few changes that you've been seeing in the HR function that come from some of these macroeconomic trends that we talked about. Now, this slide just sort of shows you how everything is linked, how important trends have an effect on almost the entire HR function. So the two are not separate. So every HR manager has to have some knowledge of what's happening in the greater economy because it will impact the HR function almost certainly. So what are some of the consequences? Well, and some of the trends in HR. One of the things that we'll spend some time talking about is this idea of distributed human resources. And this is where some companies are moving away from this idea of human resources is controlled and managed from a central location, and instead distributing it out to the branches or the stores or the locations or whatever it is. So it's distributing out some of the human resource function, which is centrally assisted by the HR department, but it's actually performed at the local level. So performance trends. Now, a lot of this has dramatically changed in the last 6 months. Again, here we are, summer 2020. There were fewer and fewer ways that human resource managers could get people to come to work for them because there just weren't enough workers. But when we look at the different ways that the human resource department can have an impact on the performance of the company, one of them is, of course, just through an efficient operation of the department. Another is through the management of employee cost. And again, this is something that has been a problem over the last few years as the market for employment has been so challenging. It's been harder and harder to hire people, and companies had to pay more and more to get people to come work for them, but that means employee costs have increased, and that's something that the HR department helps to manage. And then strategic results, of course. HR department in the recent decades, so this was not the case when I started in the corporate world in the 90s, but human resources is a much more of a strategic function now than it used to be. It used to be perceived as more of a administrative function. So HR handled payroll and it handled paperwork, that sort of thing. And it's since been elevated to a much higher level. Most large companies have a C-suite level manager in charge of human resources, and they have different titles: chief human resource officer, chief people officer, that chief, whatever version of that they have. But that addition of the HR person to the C-suite is something that has been a relatively recent change, but is much more common, and for obvious reasons. And I think by the end of this class, hopefully, you'll understand why it is such a strategic role. The other thing that that the HR department has some control over is employee engagement. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. I already mentioned it earlier, but we're going to talk about and define and quantify what do we mean by engagement, and how do we improve it, and what are the benefits of improving it, and what are the consequences of poor employee engagement. The other thing we'll talk about frequently in this class is both the impact of the sustainability movement on human resources, but also the ethical responsibilities of the human resource function. So these are all all of these things on this list, they all change. They change as the environment changes. So it's very important for human resource managers to understand their environment so that they can perform the functions of their job. Okay, so for our fourth learning objective, we're going to look at the individual skills that you as a human resource manager need to have. What kinds of things what kind of skill set do you need to have to do this job? And again, like we talked about, you'll probably all be doing some version of this job at some point. So these are the skill sets that you need to be developing as a future manager. So let's look at this chart, and this is something that I hope that by the time you're done with your business program here at PLU, that you will have checked all of these boxes multiple times probably. First is, of course, leadership. You spend a lot of time, I know, investigating and learning about leadership, but it is very important to provide strong corporate business leadership in the HR function. The ethics, the ethical practices, the implementation of policies, ethics policies, again, going back to the concept of agency, the company acts through its employees. And so the company's ethics policies are actually implemented by the people who work for the company. And that's why the HR function is so involved in the distribution of and the practice of the company's ethics policies. Business acumen, I mentioned this already. You really need to know your business. It's not enough to, as an HR function, to, I hear this a lot. I like people, so I want to go into HR. That's great, but you also need to understand the business. You need to know how your business works. You need to be a business manager so that you can provide the proper HR support. Relationship management, HR people are very much in the business of managing interpersonal relationships, both between management and employees, among employees. Oftentimes, human resource managers are counselors and problem solvers, dispute resolvers. So these are functions that skill sets that you need to have. Consultation. This one I mentioned earlier when we were talking about line management versus staff, line authority versus staff authority, and this is, as an HR person, and this is true for in-house lawyers and any sort of IT people, your client is the rest of the firm. And so while you might be an employee of the firm, you're an internal consultant. So you have to understand and learn the skills of providing advice to people, convincing people of doing the right thing, of communicating the company's policies. These are all the things that a consultant does, and having that skill set, even if you're not nominally a consultant, if you are in one of these roles, you have to have consulting capabilities. Critical evaluation, this is really important in any job, really, any service sector job for sure, but you will be interpreting and analyzing a lot of information. One of the things I'll tell you right now is if you go into HR, those of you who are considering a pathway and in that field, and you think that that you won't be working in spreadsheets, you're wrong. HR people spend almost all their time working with spreadsheets, doing budgets, doing planning, doing analysis. So you do have to have a quantitative skill set to be successful in this field. Global and cultural effectiveness. This is of growing importance. That it's not okay anymore to ignore cultural and global differences. It has to be part of the strategy. And I already mentioned communication is something that's important. So if you look at all of these, this is not really limited to the HR function. This is really any manager. This is your laundry list of skill sets that you really should have. So that brings us to the end of this video lecture. We will spend a few minutes here in our last learning objective just looking over the structure of the book and by extension of the class. So you'll notice that we're broken into 6 modules, 6 topics, large top-level topics. So each one of those has within it a certain number of topics. In general, we will be covering one topic per week in the class, but there are several weeks, and you'll see those here. They're highlighted or marked, that where we will cover two chapters in a week, and that's just because there's more chapters than weeks, and so in those weeks we'll do less of other things and cover 2 topics of material. But as I mentioned at the beginning, you can kind of see that this overall structure follows the structure of the functions of the HR department. So we'll start off in this introductory module dealing with some, definitional introductory material. Then we're going to look at staffing. So this is how do you plan for the people that you need and then go and hire them. And then after that, we move into training and development. So once you've hired them, how do you train and develop them? Then we have a whole module on compensation and rewards. And then we'll go into relations, employee and labor relations. And then lastly, there's a few special topics. So that will take us through the semester. And these follow the chapters in the book. And so if you follow along with the book, as I said, roughly 1 chapter a week, then we'll follow along this pathway through to the end of the class. There is a specific schedule on Sakai. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm recording these videos in hopes of being able to use them in future classes. So the schedule will be different from semester to semester based on things going on at the time. So please make sure you check on Sakai or with me to get the current schedule, and also make sure to pay attention to any class announcements, because sometimes we have to make adjustments based on things that happen, like for example when we have snow days, or if we have to shut down because of global disease pandemics or whatever it is, we might have to make adjustments. So this is the plan, and like all plans, it's subject to change based on what's happening around us. Okay, well, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. Please pay attention to any announcements regarding discussions. If you are in a version of this class where we will be having those discussions in person, please be prepared to have those discussions in person. If we are having them online, please make sure you participate in the online discussions as well. And of course, if you ever have any questions, you can always contact me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in next week's video.